Ready, Amal.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to this inaugural event of the Rethinking Arab Social Movement series. We're really happy and excited to have outstanding scholars today to discuss the way we can rethink Arab social movements. And when we talk about Arab social movements, we are talking about the most recent movements that we have known in the region, and especially in Algeria, Iraq, Lebanon a bit as well, Sudan, also known as Hirak or Thawra. And this series is the first session of another series of events we plan to organize on this specific topic. For today, we thought that it will be interesting to think about what we have collected in terms of knowledge, in terms of rethinking also our previous knowledge acquired or designed during the so-called first wave of the Arab Spring movements. And for that, we have, as I said, great scholars and colleagues. The order of the presentations has been a bit reversed. We will start today with Ishaq Diwan, who is a professor at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, who will reflect a bit on the political economic dynamics of these movements. Then we will have Gilbert Ashkar, which is at SOS, and we will try to rethink a bit the mobilization paradigms that we have used before for the Arab Spring, but mostly focusing on the most recent movements. Then we have Eva Belin, who is also a professor at Brandeis University, and she has worked a lot on this concept of autocracy and resilience, and she will try to think about how this concept may be still relevant today for the movements I was mentioning before. And we will end the presentations with Satani Shami, who is the director of the Arab the Arab Council for Social Sciences, and she will think about not only the question of the researchers and popular revolt, but also the notion of crisis and how this can adapt to the new context we are in. So we are going to organize the session. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to present his or her thoughts. Then we will have a first round of Q&A session. Please put your question in the chat. You may not wait for the end of each speak. You can do that through the webinar. Please put your questions on the chat, and I will pick them accordingly. So now the floor is yours, Ishaq, for a presentation on the political dynamics of this social movement.
Thank you, Amal. I'm really honored to be on the stage with you, with Eva, Gilbert, and Satine, and also many colleagues. Perhaps let me start just with a few words to say that with Amal and colleagues in Iraq, in Sudan, and in Algeria, we are involved in a research project to understand a bit more these Hirak, Thawra social movements. And this inaugural session is attended by most of them, and in the future events, they will be talking about their research. And so a goal of this session is very much to engage with them and to start discussing across countries and with other countries as well. And so we will be very much trying to contribute today with ideas about that can help them shape their research. And so this is really the social movement from the point of the researchers, what frameworks to use when they look at the trees, what's happening in their countries. And also we'll talk a little bit about how we relate personally with these movements. I think from what I understand, Satine would very much be focusing on that. So this is in lieu of an introduction. There are...
Excuse me, Ishaq, I just forgot an important element of technical details. I forgot to mention for those who want to follow in French, you have the French channel, in which we have a translation. And for those who are keen to follow in Arabic, then please choose Spanish. العربية هي it's Spanish today. So, but يمكن أنكم تطرحوا أسئلتكم في أي لغة تفضلوها. Vous pouvez poser vos questions dans la langue que vous choisirez. Voilà. This is Haq. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Amal. So indeed, we have all the languages because we have with us today our friends and colleagues in Baghdad, in Khartoum, and in Algiers as well, and we will hear from them. So I thought that since I'm starting, that I would focus on just 3 issues perhaps at the beginning, where I think some methodological framing would be helpful to the researchers, and where there are also controversies. And so perhaps the other panelists would like to contradict me so that these tensions come to the surface and become productive and useful in terms of thinking about one's country. I thought I would focus on 3. The first being the sources of grievances. The second being the kind of an alternative meaning to leaderless social movements. And finally, a discussion about a comparison between today and 2011. So three topics that I think are used by many in terms of their research today. So first, let me focus on grievances. Now, clearly, there are many possible sources of grievances, and I think I know that our researchers on the field are actually interviewing protesters, and it's going to be very useful to try to figure out what are really the more salient sources of grievances that are moving people and the youth to the streets. And really, until now, there is not a very good understanding of that because opinion polls have been very broad, not necessarily focused on protesters. And I know that at least in Iraq, there is 2 now data sets that are being looked at that are focused on a very large number of protesters. Now, as the slogans خبز حرية وعدالة اجتماعية, bread, freedom, and social justice testifies to, there are several sources. And I think it's mostly what's focused on inequality that is confusing. So let me talk about the 3 main sources that people put their fingers on. One is repression, indignities, lack of freedom, and that's very clear that many regimes have over the years used repression as a tool of governance, and increasingly so as we move 2011 and even so recently. The second one is sometimes not very appreciated, is the rollback of the state, the reduction in the size of the state over time. Just to give you a figure, illustrative figure, in Egypt, public expenditure as a share of GDP was 60% when Mubarak took over, and 30% when he left. So the state became smaller over time. That got reflected, of course, in all the services offered by the state: health, education, protection, infrastructure. And increasingly, this got cut over time. This generated a lot of petty corruption, indignities, but also importantly, increasing inequalities of opportunities of access to services, where the quality deteriorated, say, of education. The richer people went to private schools of higher quality, to private hospitals, and there was less social mobility compared to their parents, for example, and increasingly so with time, in addition to the day-to-day frustrations of unequal access, of wasta, of petty corruption. Now, the third aspect, and this is related broadly to the history of the region, with post-independence, rising modernist states, but then a breakdown in that system in the 70s and 80s, leading to the structural adjustment programs of the 80s that led to that rollback of the state, but that also led to a partial liberalization to the private sector, a different, what people call social contract. I prefer the term of a different political settlement, different alliances of the regime with the main actors in society.
Assigned interpreter.
Okay.
Amel, maybe you should ask non-participants to put their mic off.
That's why I was going to do. Could you please cut your mic so we don't have this kind of disturbances? Thank you. Please, Ishaq.
Yes. So if I continue, the third source of grievances, in addition to repression and to the rollback of the state, is the rise of this unbalanced form of liberalism, of capitalism, which we're calling crony capitalism, that really allows those very autocratic rulers to open in a very imbalanced way to the private sector, where the big firms are owned by companies close to them, so that they indirectly control the private sector, but also led to a relatively small formal private sector, a large dualism between formal and informal, between capitals and regions, with several consequences, one of which is certainly the emergence of billionaires, some very good jobs for the connected, educated people, which certainly generated more inequality in terms of the 1% and the 10%. The right-hand side of the income distribution rose, and this is something we don't see in household surveys. But on the other hand, a lot of the new educated cohorts coming to the market couldn't find good jobs. Actually, there is good research that shows that the return to education has been extremely low in this unbalanced form of capitalism, which was not dynamic, did not create jobs. A lot of the educated ended up in the informal economy or unemployed with low return, low earning, equal in poverty. So inequality on the right-hand side of the distribution with the 1%, with the 10%, equality in poverty, and frustrated expectations of the youth that thought that education will actually give them a ticket to life. And so I'm stressing that because there is this supposedly inequality mystery in the region. And it has to do with the fact that it's true we don't see Gini coefficients rising, partly because we don't measure the right-hand side, and partly because there has not been enough inequality, return to education on the lower side that allows people to educated people to do better. So that's first, I think, conceptual tool that is useful in this type of research. The second aspect I want to talk about is this leaderless, and I know others will talk about it. But what I want to stress is that part of leaderless social movement is necessary. It's not easy to change a political order that's that established, and the use, it seems to me, of leaderless movements, say like in Algiers or in Baghdad these days, or in Khartoum or in Lebanon, is to create a new political and social culture, a new national identity, which is absolutely necessary from a long-term change perspective, from a social transformation perspective, in the face of a hegemonic narrative by the ruling class, the ruling regimes, which has been extremely powerful, top-down ideologies coming from Arab nationalism and transformed over time into, through many instruments, into a socializing project, whether through official narrative and discourse, whether through religious institutions and sermons, and very importantly through the schools. And there is research on all of these, formation of values and how they're influenced in schools in particular, how they promote behaviors and values of respect for authority, of quietism in politics, of lack of participation in social action, because in school they don't teach you how to participate in community affairs, for example, in upholding the values of patriarchy, in considering that natural resources are there to burn with no respect for the environment and the like. And so, those Hirak movement, where the various forces for change kind of bottom up participates in this street movement, negotiate their parts, what part of culture they would contribute to this emerging national culture, new identity, is absolutely a central part of the social transformation that's going on. It can be certainly criticized as not enough to take over, but it also certainly lays the ground for a change over time and makes it easier for parties and associations and unions, when they exist, to play their political role in a more strategic way, depending on the circumstances. The coming together is also very important in the face of action in the past by autocrats to stay in power by dividing and ruling, you know, whether it's dividing religious versus seculars, dividing religious ethnic groups, clients and enemies. And so it's also a process of formation of a more inclusive new national identity. So I think searching for how this happens and how various groups, whether it's feminists or environmentalists or others, participates with their slogan, how they change their slogan to participate in the formation of this new culture is a great theme that many researchers are looking at across countries. I want to quickly point to my third point, to the differences between 2011 and now. Or 2019. And basically, 2011 was a period with high oil prices. It was coming on the heels of a period of high growth, relatively high growth, non-inclusive, but pretty high growth. While 2019 is a period of low oil prices, cut in half in the region, of rising debts coming after an oil boom. Many countries, Lebanon is in a crisis, but many other countries are moving in the direction of a debt crisis, and in some cases of a banking crisis. And so it resembles more actually the 80s, when this new autocratic reorganization happens. So of course, COVID made things worse. In many countries, governments have to reduce expenditure even further today, have fiscal austerity. Lebanon, Iraq, Tunisia, Algeria are cases in point. Now, at the same time, the structure of the economy is extremely weak. There's political risk. Investments have been falling. Reform have not been made in the past. Some of the cronies of the past that did some investment are in jail. So these links have been cut. So the fiscal is weak, the structure is weak, we're talking of diversification everywhere, and the street is inflamed. And so it is a very difficult situation, as I said, not unlike the 80s. And you know, in the best of circumstances, this is a challenge for society as to what to do now. It's hard on protesters. They don't trust the government. Lebanon is really a case in point. They don't trust that these reforms will help them. They fear that it will help the regime strengthen itself. And so I think the current circumstances are very different. 2011 could be called the revolution of dignity. Right now, it's really one of increasingly of hunger. And so how things develop in the future, whether there's a risk of moving to a much more chaotic situation, and we should talk of ways of improving trust, perhaps, coordination in society to try to avoid the trap ahead and move gradually to a better situation. I stop now in terms of my initial comments.
Thank you, Ishaq. You very nicely linked how finally the political economy of the capital available to people in order to renegotiate social contracts with these disappearing states may differ according to their economic and symbolic resources, and also the way it is a different process of negotiation with the state according to the position you have in that field. I think Gilbert will also very nicely complete this approach, talking about maybe not only the differences between the 2011 and 2019, 2021 movements, but also maybe how the paradigm of mobilization can be also an ongoing processes. And I will leave you the floor, Gilbert. Your mic, Gilbert, please. Your mic.
Yes, sorry, I just unmuted it. I was muted by the host. I didn't notice that. Thank you, Amel. Thank you, and thanks to all the organizers for this very nice opportunity to meet my co-panelist. That's very, I mean, a source of high pleasure for me, because that's the first time I meet most of you, if not all of you, actually. So, so that's great. I mean, first, very quickly to follow up from Ishaq, I basically agree with what Ishaq has been saying. I want to put emphasis on the rollback of the state, as he defined it, which is something that accelerated since the 90s onward with the implementation of the recommendations by the international financial institutions and the whole neoliberal framework, which was precisely aiming at that. Except that the idea was that the private sector would pick up and compensate and even overcompensate the withdrawal of the state. And this is exactly what did not happen. And that is my I mean, the way I would, I have analyzed what is going on as a result of the implementation of the neoliberal program, based on the idea of the central role of the private sector in a part of the world where the conditions, there are no conditions for a thriving developmental private sector. And what we have is indeed crony capitalism and such forms as Ishaq described them. Now here I would want to put one key issue and one word even that hasn't appeared yet in the discussion, which is that as a result of this rollback of the state, which was not compensated by private investment, we have had a slackening of growth, and the whole region has had the lowest rates of growth in Asia and Africa for the last few decades. And that whatever whatever figures you had here and there before 2011 were mostly related to oil prices, actually, and basically not reflecting a real developmental advance. And so the result is that this part of the world, when you think as a sociologist, as an economist or whatever, and you look at the world and why is this part of the world, the Middle East and North Africa, exploding, then what does it have as, as a distinct feature compared to the rest of the world? The first thing that will strike you is unemployment. The highest rate of youth unemployment in the whole world has been in this part of the world for many, many years before the explosion. And this is the buildup of this that led to the big explosion. So in that sense, of course, the economic conditions 2019 were worse than in 2011, but in 2011, they weren't good in the first place. And the nature of the revolutionary process that started in 2011 is such that they will keep degrading. And that is because the uncertainty, the instability created by the process itself adds to the general conditions that lead to this very low rates of growth that the region have been suffering from. Now, I mean, we'll probably come back to that in the discussion. But here, now let me focus on what I would call the new mobilization paradigms in the region. And so what I've just been saying explains why, in my view, actually, there is, when we look at the social movements, if we are discussing social movements, not the economy, we are discussing social movements. If we look at it from that angle, then there's no difference between 2011 as such and 2019 as such, in my view. I see more differences between various countries in 2011 and 2019. Some situations in 2019 of some countries resembling some others in 2011 and the rest. There are differences between the two waves at other levels, not the social movement level, but at the level of the political role of the Islamic forces is, of course, that's probably the most striking difference, much lower role or no role actually in 2019 compared to 2011. That's one point. And the other important difference is the role of women, which has been, I think, much more prominent in 2019 than it was in 2011. That is related to social movements, but that's the single feature that I would say makes a difference. Now, generally speaking, I think that the whole, what was called the Arab uprising, the Arab Spring, or whatever, have really signaled a new pattern of mobilizations in this new century. And these are the first big mobilizations that have been based on the use of the new information and communication technologies. We have, prior to that, the 2009 Green Movement in Iran, which was a kind of first stage, if you want, compared to what will come later on in 2011 and from now on. And these technologies are allowing for a much easier networking. And networking is not the same as organizing. Organizing means a certain degree of centralization of decision, whereas networking is more a matter of general coordination. And this has been very much at work in the movements that we have witnessed in the region. And here I would like to discuss a little bit the concept of leaderless. I think it is very impressionistic to label all the movements 2011, 2019, as some in the media have done, as leaderless, because behind this, actually, there are very different cases. And we have also a lot of political forces that just take the Egypt uprising. I mean, it started as a rally called for by 17 political parties on 25th January 2011. So that's not leaderless. And you had political coalitions, you had big political forces, the Muslim Brotherhood joined later, and the rest. So the concept of leaderless is very impressionistic, I would say, if we apply it to the whole. Now, in some cases, it may apply. I will get back to that in a second. The other point is the fact that as all movements, especially under dictatorial or despotic conditions, as we have had in the region, we have seen a broad range of class and social forces involved in the uprisings from 2011 until now. And they can be described indeed as a revolt of civil society, if you want, versus the state. If you want to take this dichotomy, the state here, including the social clientele of the state, the crony capitalism and the rest, and the immediate constituency of the state. But I can note also in observing the movements that the existence and prominent role of the labor movement have been crucial in the outcomes that you have. It's no coincidence that Tunisia, the first country to manage to get rid of a president, is the only country in the Arab region or in the MENA region, where you have an organized, a strong, powerful, organized labor movement, which is largely autonomous from the state, which had some control over the top, but not over the rank and file. And this played a crucial role in the uprising. Likewise, we've seen in Sudan, the Sudanese Professional Association played an absolutely crucial role in the uprising. We see also in Egypt and Bahrain, two countries where the labor movement was very much part of the process at the beginning, before the repression that will follow later on. Another point is the kind of organization that you had. I mean, here I'm still discussing, if you want, this whole leaderless thing, that you have different cases and we must differentiate between them. So in several countries, we had ad hoc coordination networks, either purely networks based on ICT, the internet, or coalitions, political coalitions, which were much more agreed on what they oppose, which is the existing regime, than agreeing on any common vision for what to replace it with. And hence you had later on divisions where you had such coalitions. Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Syria are four countries where you had these kinds of ad hoc coalitions which divided over time. Now, compared to that, we have had truly leaderless movements where you don't even have some coalition or coordination coming up as the leadership of the movement. And that has been the case in Algeria, in Iraq, and in Lebanon. And that has been a major source of weakness, because in the three cases, we have some impotence. Of course, Algeria was a much larger movement, but still, I mean, actually not that much larger if we compare to, for instance, what you had in Lebanon at the beginning, at the very beginning, which was also very large. But it didn't last long, because one of the key reasons being this issue of leadership. And here we have the originality of Sudan, which where we have a combination of political, the freedom and change declaration forces, labor, the Sudanese Professional Association, so two kinds of political and social coalitions, and a coordination network of the youth, the resistance committees, which is a very important component of the upsurge in Sudan. And that gives, in my view, an advantage, if you want, to Sudan in terms of power of the movement. Now, the major obstacle to radical change is generally the armed apparatuses of the state. That's, we have been speaking, Ishaq was speaking of repression. Well, that goes through also the repressive apparatus and the armed forces. And the question here is that a revolution, a radical change, a real change in the regime would require winning over this armed backbone of the states. Either, historically speaking, you have had revolutions in countries that have been defeated in wars, some of the key revolutions in history, or through some superior legitimacy, what we can call in Gramscian terms, counter-hegemony. And the example can be given, the most recent one is Iran, where in '79, the religious leadership of the revolution achieved a huge counter-hegemony, which managed to win over a big chunk of the state. Now, in the absence of both options, what we have seen in the region are basically impotent movement in that sense, where the people want the overthrow of the regime, الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام, basically became the people want someone else to do this إسقاط of the regime, of Nizam, to overthrow the regime, and usually looking at the armed forces in several cases to do that. And the one reflection of that is the occupation of squares, which I have had occasion elsewhere to explain, is a kind of testimony to the fact that you can't go beyond and occupy the centers of power. And so you occupy the square and you are expecting someone else to change the regime, if you want, or to overthrow the regime. I think I'm getting close to the time, so I want just quickly also to reiterate here my distinction between the fully patrimonial states of the 10 countries where we had uprising in 2011 and 2019. This is the case of Bahrain, Libya, and Syria. And in such states, the hardcore of the state is organically linked to the ruling family, and therefore there's no overthrow of the regime possible without war. Any illusion, I mean, any idea of of something else would be an illusion, I think. However, in neo-patrimonial states, and that's the case of Tunisia, Egypt, Algeria, and Sudan, where you don't have a family ownership of the state, even if you have family and nepotism, but it's not the same as what you had in Syria or Libya. There, the armed forces, especially where the armed forces are the major political institution, as is the case in 3 countries of the region, Egypt, Algeria, and Sudan, we have seen exactly the same scenario, exactly the repetition of the same scenario where the army overthrows the president. And that is not, of course, a revolution in the sense of really changing the regime. A revolution is one where the revolution wins over the bulk of the state apparatuses, as happened in Iran, as I mentioned, whereas what we had in those countries are what we can call conservative or reformist coup d'etats from within the regime, from within the state system, not something really changing the regime. And finally, that will be my final point. I think, I mean, the key point for me is, and I've been emphasizing this from the start, from 2011, is that what started in 2011 is the manifestation of a deep-rooted structural crisis in the region, a region that had reached this boiling point, and that it was only the beginning of what I call a long-term revolutionary process that will carry on for, actually now we can say for decades, very clearly. I see no way out of the structural crisis and deep destabilization of the region, short of a radical change in the social political system that we have in the region. And short of that, without that, I'm afraid that the only alternative will be more tragedies and actually historical regression. So that's the kind of process in which the region has been engaged in my perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gilbert. I found it extremely interesting in my own work not to divide between the structure and the temporalities of the social movements and what movements which can seem leaderless today. And I mean, I'm thinking in particular about the Tunisian case and how we may have witnessed much more two-pair tracks of social mobilizations than unidirectional evolution and of this social movement. So, and I think Eva also may have interesting things to say about these temporalities, specifically about the sacralized themes and concepts of authoritarianism and resilience. Thank you, Eva. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Amel. I'm really happy to join the conversation today. I should say that I can see I speak the same language as my colleagues, Ishaq and Gilbert, so there will be a little bit of repetition perhaps in what I'm saying. I'd also like to make clear that I am not currently conducting research on the protest movements that have taken off in Algeria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Sudan. So my knowledge of these movements is really that of an amateur, right? I read the newspapers, not always consistently. So I have to say in the beginning, I hesitated participating in this event since I'm not doing original research on this right now. But I was really intrigued by the question that was posed, which is whether the trajectories that we see in this current wave are different from the trajectories that we see in the Arab Spring of 2010 to 12, and what conceptual insights we might bring from the past to understanding the present. So I thought about this and I'm going to share just a few thoughts. First, let me just start off by saying what we all know, that there was not one single trajectory of uprising in the Arab world in 2010 and between 2010 2012. Yes, there was one thing that was common to all three cases. All involved mass protest that was massive, that was sudden, that was contagious. That was amazing. But aside from this, the uprising across the Arab world took very different paths. Some turned violent in the face of harsh repression by the state. And there, of course, I'm thinking of Syria and Libya and Yemen. Some were utterly repressed. Think of Bahrain. Some delivered the downfall of the dictatorship. Think of Tunisia and Egypt. But only one managed to transition to democracy, and that was Tunisia. So these countries followed very different trajectories, and those trajectories were shaped by very different conditions. And just as we saw diversity in the experiences of these Arab countries a decade ago, I expect we will see the same kind of diversity in the paths and outcomes that we see in Lebanon, Sudan, Iraq, and Algeria today. But that said, there are certain generalizable patterns that can be drawn from the Arab Spring examples that I think are illuminating for the current cases under study. And so what I'm going to do is identify these patterns and suggest them to scholars as a tool that might be useful to analyze the course of events in the current wave. So I learned three important lessons from the events of the Arab Spring a decade ago. I'll say them very quickly up front. The first was, to force change, you must have popular protest that is large, nonviolent, and costly. And let me emphasize costly. It has to be costly to the regime in power. Second, for protests to bring change, you need a coercive apparatus that will not shoot on the people. And third, for this combination of popular protest and coercive restraint to actually yield some meaningful political change, some change in political institutions, you need popular leadership that is focused, respected, and that has deep, credible roots in civil society networks. So let me explore each of these in a little more depth. First, with regard to the size and character of protest. To effect change, the protest has to be large, non-violent, and costly. So the fact that the protest needs to be large is pretty obvious, right? Nobody cares if 100 members of the Kifaya movement protested on the steps of the government buildings during the Mubarak era, right? The regime could just ignore those 100 people or arrest them, all the participants. The fact that the protest needs to be nonviolent is also pretty obvious, because violence by protesters invites repression by the coercive apparatus. It sets off that instinct by the coercive forces to defend law and order. Protesters want to avoid that. The fact that protests need to be costly might be a little less obvious. By costly, I mean that the persistence of these protests should weigh heavily on the authorities in power. It should not be a situation where the authorities can afford to wait out the protesters, because in a waiting game, the authorities have the advantage. Time is not on the side of protesters. It's very costly for our average citizens to keep up massive protests. People get tired, people have to get back to work. The general population gets exhausted. Now we see this in cases, for example, of Serbia. You had massive protests against Milosevic in 1996-97, hundreds of thousands of people protesting. Those protests went nowhere. Milosevic just waited them out, and eventually they just dissipated. By contrast, in 2000, in Serbia, large protests, but what was different was the protesters made an alliance with coal workers who carried out a major strike, cut off major energy supplies to the country. Milosevic could not afford to ignore those protests and wait them out. And so those protests had impact, and he ultimately had to leave. I'm simplifying that story, but it's just to make clear that costliness matters. Now, I emphasize this because I think this is a problem in Algeria. Again, this is just from my very superficial understanding of the Algerian case, but it seems to me that the protests are not costly enough for the regime. And so the regime just seems to be waiting them out hoping that the protesters will exhaust themselves. And I think that's a very real concern. The second observation drawn from the Arab Spring experience is, for the protests to yield change, the coercive apparatus must choose not to shoot on protesters. If the coercive apparatus decides to side with the regime and use force, the game is up. So we have to look at the factors that determine whether the coercive apparatus will side with the regime or not. And here my comments will, to some degree, echo what my colleague Gilbert just said. There is a huge literature on this, but there are three questions to ask that shape the behavior of these forces. First, are the members of the coercive apparatus themselves invested in the survival of the regime? Will they be ruined by the fall of the regime? Their investment in the regime's survival could come from any number of paths. It could come from patrimonial linkages, by family, by tribe, think of Syria. It can come from co-optation. You know, they benefit from special economic privileges that are linked to the survival of the regime. Think of the military in Bahrain. It could come from ideology. Think of the generals in Tiananmen Square who were deeply invested ideologically and historically in the survival of the Communist Party in China. They were going to shoot on the civilians no matter what. If the coercive apparatus, either as an institution or its leaders, are deeply invested in regime survival for any of these reasons, forget about protests delivering regime change. Second, is there social distance between members of the coercive apparatus and the protesters? Do they share the same class, the same ethnicity, the same region, the same religion? The more similar the army and the police and the protesters are demographically, the less chance you will get massacre by the coercive forces. It's not for sure, but this is just a numbers game. Third, has the regime successfully castrated the independent power of the coercive apparatus? And this can be made possible through any number of what we call coup-proofing strategies or coup prevention strategies. For example, does the regime shuffle around officers so they can't build their own power bases? Has the regime built multiple militias that check and balance each other and prevent anyone from acting independently and without consequence? So these three characteristics, personal investment in the regime, social distance from the protesters, level of coup proofing, these all explain to a large degree why the military did not shoot on protesters in Tunisia, why it did shoot on them in Syria and Bahrain. So that's something to keep in mind. The third observation drawn from the Arab Spring experience has to do with the importance of leadership. Now, there was a great deal of celebration at the time of the Arab Spring about how those protests were spontaneous and leaderless. And this was celebrated, especially by academics, I think, because this leaderlessness, to the extent that it was true, made the protests seem more popular and more authentic. The truth is that if your goal is to move beyond just bringing down the dictator, if your goal is really to build something politically new, like democratic institutions, you need leaders. You need leaders who are ideologically committed to this political project of building democratic institutions. You need leaders who have real popular credibility based on their long service to their communities. And you need leaders who have deep links in civil society networks that they can then mobilize to pressure opposing forces in order to make compromises and concessions that are necessary to build political institutions. So the fact that Tunisia had such leaders as Hussein Abbasi and Rashid Ghannouchi, both people deeply committed to putting in place democratic institutions, both credible leaders that commanded the respect of their constituents, both with deep networks in civil society and the trade union movement and the Islamist movement that then could be mobilized to bring popular pressure to bear to keep the political agenda going forward. That was absolutely essential to Tunisia's transition. And where that leadership was absent, and as in the case of Egypt, the downfall of the autocrat, thanks to popular protest, did not make way for the rise of democracy. It just paved the way to the rise of another autocrat. So what light do these three lessons from the Arab Spring shine on the current protest movements in Iraq, Lebanon, Sudan, and Algeria? to me, most importantly, they pose research questions worthy of investigations. So are the protests large, peaceful, and most importantly, are they costly? In what way? Second, is the coercive apparatus deeply invested in regime survival? And if so, why? And third, is their popular leadership credibly committed, deeply committed to the democratic project with strong and credible roots in civil society? So that's what I would explore. The last thing I will say about lessons from the Arab Spring, and I'm almost done, is I'd like to identify two things that clearly, to my mind, differentiate the current protest movements from the Arab Spring protests of a decade ago. And the first, to state the obvious, these current protests come later. They come after the Arab Spring protests. This is going to echo what some of my colleagues have said. And that means that people have an opportunity to learn from the past. And it's not just the protesters who can learn, but also regimes. Regimes can learn from the past as well. And we see this in Egypt, in Egypt under Sisi. Right? Sisi's regime has learned from the events of 2011, 2012. And as a result, his regime has become much more repressive than that of Mubarak's regime. You have mass arrests, disappearances of activists, the shutdown of public debate, all in the hopes of preventing the kind of mass protest that took off in 2010, 2011, that brought down his predecessor. Now, is this the case in any of the 4 countries under study? You know, is Lebanon, is Iraq, is Sudan, is Algeria about to embrace the kind of brutal repression that we see in Egypt? I don't know, but that's something to think about. That's certainly a lesson from the past. The second factor that differentiates current protests from Arab Spring protests is the role of social media. So this again will echo something that my colleague, Professor Gilbert Ashkar said. In 2011, 2012, social media, the internet, cyber communication was celebrated as an enabler of popular mobilization and protest, and it certainly was crucial. But 10 years later, we see how effectively autocratic regimes are using cyber tools to repress opposition, whether through cyber surveillance, through control and perversion of communication among people on these sites. This is a very different dynamic from what we saw a decade ago. Frankly, to my mind, one of the most terrifying dynamics of this decade. And it is, its impact on popular mobilization is certainly worth exploring. So I guess I'll leave it there. And I look forward to questions and what my colleagues have to say.
Thank you, Eva. I think it was really relevant to bring to us the concept of the cost of social change, and again, I think it's not that easy even for the first rank actors to think about the cost of social change in a context of crisis, in a context where it's difficult to envision any kind of change outside of the revolutionary framework, which may, in which the protesters may believe for a time, but then acknowledge that alternative solutions have to be found. I think that Setene has also this reflection on crisis as a context of production knowledge. So please, Setene, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could I share the screen and use a PowerPoint? It's mainly to keep myself organized. So can you see the screen?
Perfect. You may wish to put it on full screen. Perfect.
Okay, thank you very much to all my colleagues, the previous speakers, to the organizers. I am going to speak a little bit differently, actually, and I'm going to focus more on how knowledge about social movements and about the current context of crisis is produced, and especially within the region. As a caveat, I don't usually want to make too much of a distinction between knowledge produced in the region and on the region, but we can talk more about that during the question and answer. But I'm speaking from my position at the Council for Sciences, where we are struggling with this difficult context, both as an institution that is seeking to remain meaningful and contribute positively to change and social transformation, and also an organization that is trying to support researchers and knowledge producers of different kinds, and not only academic researchers. So this is where my presentation is coming from this point of view. And because of having a fairly short time, I will be speaking in rather broad headlines and raising more questions than answers, but I have been thinking rather deeply about these issues. And so if there's time in the discussion, I'm happy to go more in depth into these issues. So my fellow panelists have already talked about the kinds of changes and dislocations and disruptions and fragmentations that the region, but also the world, is undergoing in these few years. And the way in which, of course, the COVID pandemic has highlighted all of the other previous sort of earlier dislocations and instabilities, and has really been a lens through which we can see even more clearly the lack of trust in state authorities, the inequalities, the desperate inequalities, and the suffering of marginalized communities, not least displaced and refugee communities. So the questions I'm trying to get at in this presentation is what the status of research in the region in the light of these crises and the fall of old orders, the rise of new hegemonies, and how are research communities and institutions responding to heightened demands for new knowledge? These are not the same question. They sound like the same question, but I think this issue of new knowledge is important, and I will come back to it. I think there's a qualitatively different kind of knowledge that is required rather than a sort of traditional knowledge that can be categorized as academic knowledge on one hand, media knowledge on the other hand, civil society knowledge on the third hand. So I'll come back to these throughout the presentation. We have already heard about the important and profound structural changes that are taking place within the countries of the region. But I want to also, point to an issue which I'm sure no one will disagree with, which is that we also need to take a regional and trans-regional lens to what's going on, and not to analyze these social movements and these changes only within the confines of each nation state, however important comparative research might be. There are issues here that go beyond and go through and go under and over nation states or state borders. And so one of the important issues that we see in the region are new antagonisms, new struggles for regional influence, complex patterns of interstate rivalries, and so on. And closely coupled to these, and my colleagues have spoken about the political economy of these countries and of the region, there's a deep reconfiguration of trade, finance, and investment flows. And all of these regional trends are taking place within an increasingly unstable and fragile global order. And so the simple point I'm trying to make here is that you don't have stability out there and instability within the region. You have instability globally and change globally. And there's a co-construction of the regional and the global that is taking place that's also very important for us to understand. And the focus on war and conflict often, and I'm speaking here as an anthropologist, that's my discipline, often overshadows the region's significant role in mediating global networks of trade, logistics, infrastructure, and finance. And so, we need to sort of go back to older literatures, I think, and to look at the kinds of regional and sub-regional inequalities, the kinds of dependencies that are being created, and of course, new types of populations, new types of refugees, new types of displaced populations, new types of urban dislocation, rural dislocation, and so on. As I mentioned, everything I say comes through the work of the ACSS, and so I acknowledge them in these very brief footnotes, that these are ideas that are not only my own, but that are coming through our projects. So in this kind of context, the academic research that's being produced in the region and on the region is really struggling, I believe, to keep up with these contexts and with these realities. And so for me, it's very important that we question, not only question our frameworks and question our theories and concepts, but we question our academic structures of teaching, research, funding, knowledge production, and ask if the structures that we have for knowledge production, the infrastructures that we have for knowledge production, are able to address the needs of these times. And so on one hand, these contexts definitely challenge our existing abilities to produce knowledge and relevant knowledge. We can come to what is relevant knowledge. But also we have to acknowledge that there are new actors and new thought communities that are also emerging in the region. Now, the structural challenges for research in the Arab region are well known, and I don't have to rehearse them for this audience. But the point I want to make is that in addition to all of these deteriorating infrastructures of knowledge production, we have the context that we have been talking about for the past hour, over and above all the problems that our universities and research centers and so on face daily, as well as face in terms of long-term programs. So over and above all of these infrastructural inadequacies of knowledge production, we also have a situation of urgency, and we have a disjuncture of temporality. So urgency, meaning that not only does funding come in huge amounts to look at issues of the moment, whatever these funding bodies decide are the issues of the moment, but in addition, of course, there is a sort of moral, emotional, and skills to address issues of the moment, to try and help, to try and find solutions. And this is a real imperative, I think, for researchers, a felt imperative. I don't mean I think it's an imperative. I mean that researchers in the region feel it's an imperative to address what is happening and to try and research what is happening in ways that will help ameliorate the situation. And this is problematic. It's problematic because our frameworks, our concepts, our methods, our ways of doing research aren't necessarily geared towards urgent types of research. And we can talk about this further because, of course, like the development agencies and humanitarian agencies have for decades developed sort of almost in a way para tools or parallel sets of tools, of social science tools to do research, rapid research, and sort of assessment research and evaluation research and these kinds of research, which tend to be ignored by academic communities and not to be sort of given the status of academic research. And yet, when you're surrounded by sort of change that may be exciting and you may, constructive on one level, depressing and sort of, debilitating on another and so on, there is a sense of urgency. And what this means is that researchers in the region tend to then jump on whatever the latest sort of situation is and to try and research it and to try and write about it and so on, regardless of whether they have any kind of background or training or sort of long-term investment in those kinds of topics. At the same time, the issue of temporality is that there's a basic sort of conundrum or even a conflict. So good research, good academic analysis needs time and space for reflection, for discussion, for feedback and so on. But there's also a demand for immediate responsive writing and dissemination. And so these shape the ways in which knowledge is being produced in the region about, about social movements, about the Hirak, about economic and economic regression, about all of these issues that we're talking about. So, so deteriorating infrastructures of research, urgency and demand for fast and quick and responsive research. And then the third factor, which is interesting, is sort of new knowledge connections that are being made. So academics and activists and civil society and advocacy groups and so on, coming together in new conversations and new collaborations. And this is what I meant by new thought communities in an earlier slide. And so, what I've been calling interstitial actors, groups, collectives that come together and that try to produce sort of knowledge that is important to them and important to the audiences that they speak to. And so I would say that there are 5 sorts of needs that knowledge production in these times need to address. And I don't think I'm saying that that there haven't been times like this before, times of revolution, times of upheaval, times of rapid change, but talking for the moment about these times and the kinds of new knowledge that is needed for these times. It seems to me these are the issues that we need to think about, both on an individual, as individual researchers, both on an individual level, but also as organizations that are helping, supporting, promoting knowledge production. So first of all, I think we need to address the fact that there are hierarchies of knowledge production that need to be questioned. The idea that knowledge produced in a university is more valuable than knowledge produced in civil society or produced by the media or produced by activists or produced by advocacy institutions, that these are certainly different kinds of knowledge. I'm not disputing that, but we do not need to assume a certain hierarchy among them. And instead, we should be creating new partnerships and new conversations that try to bring these different kinds of knowledge together. We should try to theorize from the street, and theorizing from the street means making new connections with new kinds of actors, going outside the university or bringing them into the university and trying to learn from the street. The first conference that the ACSS, the Arab Council, organized was called Arab Uprisings Interrogate the Social Science. And this is also the theme of our 5th conference. So, the first one was in 2013, so connected to the events of 2010, 2012. And the conference this year is reflecting in some ways on 2019, 2020. And in both cases, we feel as a social science organization, a social science and humanities organization, that the change that's going around us, that's taking place around us, is actually putting us as social scientists on the spot and asking us how relevant and how enduring our concepts and frameworks are. A third need is to amplify the role of trans-regional scholars and to facilitate new circulations and collaborations. There are all sorts of ruptures and all sorts of conversations that could be taking place between different researchers and different scholars, which are not taking place sufficiently. And very importantly, of course, we need to think about the context in which a new generation of researchers is coming into maturity, if we want to put it that way. So these contexts we've been talking about from 2010 until the present, there's a whole generation of students who are graduating from social science and humanities departments at Arab universities. So what are they learning in these universities? To what extent is there a connection, or more likely a disconnect, from what they are seeing in their lives and what they're seeing in the streets and what they're seeing in society around them? And how can we play a role in providing support and training for a new generation of researchers to be connected to what's going around them instead of disconnected? And finally, a very, very set of issues around doing research in conflict, in context of conflict, and how you uphold research ethics and academic freedom at the same time. How do you undertake research in situations of instability and danger to the researcher, danger to the research community, danger all around, as well as, of course, increased authoritarianism, increased control over academic freedom and freedom of speech. So in Rethinking Crisis and how producing knowledge in a context of crisis, the implications of that is, first of all, that we have to think of crisis not as something transitional or passing. Gilbert talked about deep structural crisis that will continue on for decades. So that is, I'm echoing here that sort of idea. But we've had deep structural crises in the past that have been somehow silent. And this is a deep structural crisis, which is very noisy, which is exploding and imploding and is loud and is demanding and it is not, no one's going quietly into the night, okay? So, so it's definitely a structural crisis, but it's also one which, and maybe here I'm reflecting the fact that I'm living here in Beirut, you are bombarded with it every minute. You know, the minute you step out in the street, you are in that crisis mode. You're not just sort of studying it from a distance or watching it from somewhere. So crisis itself is an object of analysis and knowledge production, and at the same time, crisis shapes and reshapes processes of knowledge production in fundamental ways. And the final point I was making, I'd like to summarize in saying that this knowledge about crisis and knowledge in crisis is being produced by institutions. It's like universities and research centers and so on. It's being produced by interinstitutional efforts, which is like the ACSS, networks of institutions and networks of scholars and so on. But it's also being produced in through interstitial efforts, through collectives, through groups of people that come together informally to produce knowledge. And of course here, the digital platforms and electronic platforms and all of that help such groups to find a voice, or at least to become one voice in the cacophony that surrounds us in cyberspace. And so, you know, my earlier points about connections and partnerships and so on was a way of thinking through the institutional, the interinstitutional, and the interstitial. And I think in many ways, you know, this categorization of how knowledge is produced also reflects or is in a way a counterpart in the knowledge sphere, let's say, of what's happening in the political sphere. And again, to summarize and to repeat, so we have new knowledge ecosystems that are developing in the region, and much of this, I have to say, gives me a sense of optimism. I don't know how long-lived optimism it is, but it gives me a sense of optimism. I see a lot of energy. I see a lot of efforts by individuals and by groups. And we need to know that these ecosystems are taking place in the context of a global restructuring of academia, universities, knowledge landscapes, and so on. We know that everywhere the university is in crisis. We know everywhere the social sciences and humanities are in crisis, and so on. And so these are, we cannot separate sort of what's happening in the region from what's happening elsewhere. And finally, as sort of this webinar and other occasions for people to come together and to talk, we are searching for new agendas, conceptual agendas, in order to understand all of these changes that we are living through and that we are part of as well, and that we are helping shape at the same time that we study them and research them and talk about them. So, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sitini. I think that for us as academics, it was fascinating. And if you allow me, I would like to maybe redirect directly to you two questions that I think can be linked to your presentation. There's Farah Shukar, who has asked about the NGOization of social movement as a framework of analysis. I believe she was referring to the founding of this social movement. I think it would be interesting to learn from you about the way funding is also orientating some kind of knowledge production around this social movement. And there was also another question on, or a remark from Rada Moussa, who was saying that what the region needs most is really a cultural change, and that in the course of the past 10 years, she doesn't believe that we could rely on protest, large or small. Also, I would like to maybe you to explain us what has been done from the knowledge produced from the and within these popular protest social movements, and maybe what can be done in the future. And then we will continue with the rest of the questions to the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. These are very interesting questions. Yes, the NGOization of social movements and of almost everything. I mean, Gilbert talked about how the private sector was supposed to pick up the slack of where the state withdrew, but in fact, what happened in the region to a large degree is that NGOs, large and small, tried to pick up the slack, and with different sort of with different records of success. And yes, and here sort of funding, global funding from the West, from multilateral institutions, from bilateral institutions, and so on, has played a large part of this and in this. And so, so you have, let's say, the formal sphere of institutions of knowledge production, and then you have NGOs that, of course, do not only produce knowledge, they produce knowledge, but they also try to affect change. And the question here is, who is doing? It's very interesting to see kind of the disconnect between universities and NGOs on one level, on a sort of structural level. On the other hand, lots of people are moving between the university and the NGO and civil society sector. And one of the things that I've been saying a lot recently is that there's this huge sort of reserve army of MA students who are the ones who are basically sort of making this movement, or who are, this population that is going between the university and the NGOs. They're the ones who are mostly doing the research in NGOs. They're the ones who are also studying in these MA programs in the universities. As you know, there aren't many PhD programs in the region. North Africa has more PhD programs in social science and humanities than the Mashriq, or the Gulf, but there are a lot of MA programs, and it's very important, I think, to look at these young people who are students in these MA programs and who mainly sort of do the research in the NGO sector. The problem is that this research created by the NGO sector is not examined, it's not evaluated, it's not put into any kind of conversation with academic research. So the NGOization of social movements and the NGOization of knowledge production or of research are the same phenomenon, really. But both of them, you know, but there's also this, what I call the interstitial, which is even less formally organized than the NGO sector. The NGO sector actually, as you know, states have done a lot to try and control it, to try and organize it, to try and discipline it in many ways, and so do international funders. Whereas these more informal groups, I think, are even more interesting to look at. And to see what kind of knowledge and what kind of barriers there are between, you know, between applied and theoretical and things like that. Sorry, I can't remember now the second question.
The second question was on the need for a cultural movement and the usefulness of protests, small or large.
What kinds of movements? I'm sorry, I'm not hearing very well.
The usefulness, are protests useful actually, and in particular to...
Yeah. Okay, yeah, actually, this is very interesting. I mean, in Lebanon particularly, because I was here, of course, during the 2019, 2020 protests, you know, the protests, the space of the protests was also a space of debating what kind of knowledge do we need? What kind of information do we need? What do we need to understand? There was, I do agree with Ishaq, that there was a kind of a moment, at least, I don't know how deep it went, but a moment of rethinking citizenship, a moment of rethinking what does participation mean? What do we need to know about constitutional law? What do we need to know about personal law? What do we need to know about elections, about environment, and so on? And so there was a lot of, not only a lot of discussion and debate and information flowing and you know, teach-ins and all of that, but there was also a discussion about a very, and at some points, a very sort of tense discussion about the kinds of expertise that is needed in society for the protests to succeed, and the usefulness or not, or you know, lack of usefulness of certain kinds of academic knowledge and so on. And here it was not only what was being said, but where it was being said and how it was being said. Was it being presented in a tent? Was it being presented in a square? Was it being presented in a protected space? So there was a lot of discussion of the kinds of knowledge and also the medium of transmitting this knowledge or of engaging in debate and discussion and so on. Very, very interesting dynamics indeed. But then, you know, it ended, and I think we have a responsibility to keep those questions alive. We don't have to have them being thrown at us in the street in order to feel their importance and their urgency. We do need to keep them, I think, alive, this question. Thank you.
Thanks, great. Thanks a lot, Setani. To continue in the reverse order, I would like, Eva, maybe if you would like to focus on the question on the leaderless as a, I quote, conceptually weak, or has a concept that is weak, and maybe the necessity to focus on the means of these protest movements to explain the apparently leaderless shape of it, and also to the search for a different leadership pattern in the Arab world. I know that you have described how movements who had no leaders may have not been able to make real institutional transformations, but maybe you can reflect a bit upon this idea of considering these movements as leaderless, and maybe in the cases or studies also that you have analyzed.
So I think the excitement over this term, leaderless, grew up in the first wave when, you know, people were able to organize these, what were they, flash protests, right? You would just put the word out and everyone would show up. And so you didn't need to have those old networks of contacts and connections to organize a protest. I think that's why people got so excited about this idea of leaderlessness. But I don't think it has served anyone's interest in the long run. I think it turns out that you actually do need repetitive connections with people to build trust and to really get people to show up and do difficult things over time. And certainly, if you have leaders who do, people who claim leadership and haven't built those networks of connection over long terms of service, they're not really capable of delivering the kind of political change that we want. I'm very interested in what Professor Ashkar said about Sudan and the fact that there seems to be a very strong civil society, strong networking, organizing, I'm sure each of those 4 organizations you mentioned have strong leaders with strong experience. And that makes me very optimistic about the Sudanese case of actually delivering change. The Algerian case, I'm really quite disturbed by when I hear Algerians proudly saying, we don't have leaders and we don't want leaders and we want it to be spontaneous, because that seems to me to be the path to powerlessness. So I don't know if that speaks to what you were getting at. I don't know if Professor Ashkar wants to build on that. He knows some of these cases much better than I think.
Yeah, thank you, Eva. Sure, please, Gilbert, if you would like to comment maybe on the Sudanese case as well.
Yes, I mean, I tried to say that the only cases where you can speak of leaderless are indeed Algeria, Lebanon, and Iraq. That's the 3 countries where you can't identify some kind of epicenter of the movement or some kind of coordination at the very least, if not leadership of the movement. All other cases have had such coalitions, whatever they are, coordinations. Even in Syria, you had the local coordination committees, and they were working as an organized network and acting as the leadership of the movement. We mentioned what you had in Egypt and the rest. So yes, we have 3 countries where we don't have that. And that's more a product, whatever people may say that, like Eva, you were saying very rightly, some people make it a matter of pride, but actually is a sign of weakness, that is the lack of, yes, as you said, trust and confidence among a number of actors, social and political actors actually, or social or political actors who could agree on working together, at least against the common enemy, if you want. Even if they don't have enough agreement on what to put instead. And that's what we have had. And indeed, you made a very correct observation on the powerlessness of the movement in Algeria. It was absolutely impressive in scope and all that. But, you know, demonstrating on the closure day, every Friday, yes, as you said, it's not costly at all. I mean, that's not a problem for the military. They can watch that forever. And I mean, okay, their patience has limits, and they seize the opportunity of COVID to implement a full crackdown on the movement, which is carrying on now to prevent it from resuming. But yes, that was showing the weakness actually of the movement. And the same goes, although it's a higher level, because it's permanent, it's not every Friday, the occupation of squares. But the occupation of squares also, you know, that's also a way of saying we're here until the regime falls. But who is going to bring down the regime? So you don't have the assault on the Bastille, if you want. Yeah? You don't have the kind of the Winter Palace or whatever in the imaginary of revolutions that you have. So you're more stuck in a kind of war of position, whereas to bring down power, you need a war of movement. And that's not what we have in those cases. Well, Sudan is definitely the most advanced in combining the three levels of political coalition, where you had dissension since then, social coalition, labor coalition, let's say, and youth networking, very impressively. The problem is in the dissension in the political coalition, of course, fed by the military and those who are backing the military. So the problem in Sudan, they are facing a formidable enemy, an entrenched military power, which is backed by all the regional reaction, very powerfully backed by Egypt, Saudi Kingdom, United Arab Emirates, you name them. I mean, all these countries are there, very much interfering in what's going there. So it's very tough, difficult to be, you know, just optimistic. There is hope, definitely. That's one of the countries where one can be more hopeful than others in other countries. But it is a very tough nut to crack. And that's the problem in general. And here I will also comment on one thing Eva said, is about the non-violence. I don't think we can put the onus on the social movement, on the protest movement. Everywhere they tried to be silmiya. Everywhere they tried to be non-violent. But you don't, it's not, I mean, when you are facing an entrenched kind of power where you are willing to use its repressive force, its armed forces to crash the movement, then you are faced with either surrendering or then it turns into civil war. That's what we could have. Just to give an example, the Syrian movement tried its best to remain peaceful, but then the logic of the regime, you know, started escalating repression, killing more and more people to force them actually into turning into a war, which suited the regime better. Compare that with Myanmar. That's what, I mean, that's, you can't have more non-violent movement than this movement around in Myanmar against the military. And yet even there, they are now more and more turning towards, you know, allying with regional and ethnic armed movements against the military, because at some point that's the only alternative that movements can be faced with. Right. So that's I think the main problem that we will be facing. The issue is really this idea of counter-hegemony, the ability of the movement to build such a counter-hegemony that it managed to win over the rank and file of the armed forces. That's absolutely crucial. And that happened in one case in particular in Sudan, where the military were faced with the beginning of rebellion of some soldiers and officers, actually, I mean younger officers, sympathizing with the crowd, with the movement. And that was a major problem for the Sudanese military, which prompted them to get rid of Bashir. You know, when they saw this at the beginning, that is what prompted them to get rid of Bashir. Amel, you wanted to say something? Sorry.
Gilbert, if I can jump on that, because you just had two questions. If I can jump on what you are saying, because you just had two questions actually on Sudan. And one is actually on this, because there was one remark on the fact, and I think from the name of the people who asked is Algerian, and the fear that a unified leadership is not possible. And I think we also have to understand the history, as you rightly mentioned, of these movements in these countries. And there's actually a question on whether, despite the different revolutionary forces in Sudan, the youth movement is likely to be undermined. So we also have to reconsider maybe this Sudanese experience has successful in representing all segments of society. And she said all political parties more likely to be conservative and reformist will take over because of the absence of political training and teen political conception of the goal of the revolution. And she has another question on whether the self-conception of the movement in Sudan has being more than conservative reformist is likely to have an impact on the trajectory.
Well, that's that's many questions, but very quickly, I tried already in commenting on or replying to Eva's question, try to dampen, if you want, or diminish the optimism about Sudan and emphasize how difficult the task is that is facing them. Now, I think that from what I've seen is that the most solid for the time being component of that revolutionary process is this, this coordination, this collaboration between the resistance committees, this network at the level of neighborhoods, which is absolutely impressive, and the Sudanese Professional Association. And indeed, the problem is with the political forces, most of which are political forces that are willing to collaborate with the military, under some conditions. And few are those willing really to go all the way in dismantling military dictatorship in Sudan and establishing a real democracy. So that's the point here. But again, I mean, the movement is quite strong. And after all, in Tunisia, now Tunisia was a much easier case in the sense that you don't have this kind of entrenched military dictatorship, and you had even actually one of the weakest armies in the region. And so you had a police state to a large extent, but that could be neutralized by the scope of the movement and the existence of the union, the role of the UGTT, the labor movement, and some of the components of civil society. So you have an even stronger case at the level of the leadership in Sudan with what the Sudanese Professional Association has become as a much more now today encompassing labor movement, and this connection with the rank and file youth networks, that is very, very powerful. But the enemy they face is very, very, very difficult, very vicious. And again here, one of their strengths, and to get back to what Eva was saying, is indeed that they have a leverage. They had a leverage. When the military tried in June 2019 to crush the movement, they implemented a general strike and civil disobedience all over the country, which paralyzed the whole economy and the rest. And the military could say that, there is a high price to pay if we go forward. And that made the military stop and then get into compromise. And that's what produced the compromise, because that was a compromise, nothing more, between the movement and the military. But that's where it is today. They are still negotiating within this compromise, which the military are progressively emptying of its major aspects and content. And that's where it is. And the movement tried to resume. COVID played its role. COVID, we should say, played a counter-revolutionary role in the region, generally speaking, although the consequences of COVID, I think, as Haq was pointing to that, are to increase or aggravate the crisis, this crisis that has been unfolding in the region in an accelerated form, deepened form since 2011. got even worsened by the situation created by COVID, not to mention specific cases like Lebanon, where the whole, our whole economic system built over the last few decades is crumbling, completely crumbling, and the country is drifting away. No one knows where to. So yes, and I will end also exactly by getting to this issue, that the structural crises have been building up until the boiling point was reached in 2011. Now, the boiling point, that means the region entered in a revolutionary process, is a period of revolutionary change and destabilization and the rest. And this is cumulative in the sense that those conditions, the conditions of the upheaval themselves, weigh on the social economic crisis and worsen it and aggravate it. And this is a kind of vicious circle in which you get, in which the region is, and that is going on in my estimation, in my assessment, for a long period to come, unless, of course, the movements find some way to move forward, which we are still to witness.
Thank you, Gilbert. Thanks a lot. And finally, Ishaq, there was two questions directed to you about, well, finally, the big losers of social and economic change, and especially in a context where the state may not disappear, but change dramatically. And there was a very complete question from Farah, who was asking about the who will pay the cost of social change, and she was giving the example of how the expansion of the state service delivery plus security arm was financed, and second, the price of the state withdrawal, and third, who actually is paying for the price of the hybrid model that we ended up with, which basically eroded the fiscal space. And so this is a broad question. I will leave it up to you to pick and choose the elements you would like to answer.
Thank you. Now I'll answer Farah's question, and I will combine it with Rula's question that also comes back to Satine's discussion about the role of the researchers and the intellectual. And I want to take also this opportunity to really thank Rula for personal support for our project and for what we're doing here. I think in this discussion, I have to inject now some economics. I mean, the economic model has not been working for decades now. And this is a major cause, one of the major causes for all the political problem, for the social difficulties that the region is having. And the economic model has not been reconstructed in spite of its failure in the 1980s and 90s. What was reconstructed was a model that did not work, which has led to 2011, and it still has not been rethought properly. And I think the role of the thinker, of the researchers, at least in this emerging new national cultural identity, is to participate actively in thinking about where is it that these societies, these countries want to go in the future. In all countries, literally, of the region, and Lebanon is a prime example today, but also Sudan, Algeria, Iraq, the level of living is way below the potential of these countries. They have to be organized in a very different way in order to be able to achieve what they can achieve for the future. The goal is not to come back to 60% of expenditure to GDP by the state, clearly. The goal is to have a much larger pie, economic pie, to divide among everyone through higher productivity, more inclusion, more innovation, more investment, more meritocracy, more effort, more competition, I would say. And Gilbert may not agree, but this is the moment to be debating these issues and putting together a vision for the future. Less clientelism and cronism and defensive system to keep, you know, a small, narrow ruling elite ruling over a small pie where they get a large share of a smaller pie. We need more creation now in society to imagine this future world. And the role of researcher is key here. On economics, I would argue in particular, because there is very little understanding of economics in the region. It's been dominated by politics and fights, and not by thinking about how to grow a larger pie. Give you a few examples. In Lebanon now, in spite of the crisis, me and many others are engaged in thinking about a model for the future. The old model is dead. Money will not just flow like oil would not flow anymore in Algeria. And so how do we imagine an economic model for the future, a different one? Some people are classical, others are more to the left. You know, that debate has to take place in order to start shaping the tensions, the issues, the vision for the future. In Sudan, where the economy has completely collapsed, you have hyperinflation, the very courageous movement, professional labor union that died, gave many martyrs for this revolution to succeed, turns out to have at its core old communists. This is the fifth revolution in Sudan. And the communists somehow have played a key role in all of this. But the communists are against the private sector, against the lifting of subsidies and replacing them with direct transfer to stop printing money. And so Sudan has had enormous difficulty, still has, in stabilizing its economy, which is the main promise of the revolution. In Tunisia, the unions that played a fantastic role in delivering democracy, as Hubert has argued, keep in a corporatist way asking for higher wages. And this is taking Tunisia in the wall from a macroeconomic perspective, because that's the role they've always played. There's not enough of perhaps cooperation, but also economic thinking of a competitive Tunisia for the future that can create in a sustainable way jobs for its educated population, same as in Lebanon. So I think a main failure of the past has been the fear of these narrow autocrats to open up to the private sector. And much can happen, in my mind, with a much more competitive, meritocratic private sector. I would end by stressing the role of armies in many countries. I mean, both Eva and Gilbert spoke of these armies that shoot on people, the patrimonial model. But even in other countries, Algeria, Egypt, Sudan, more professional armies are acting in their corporate interests, not shooting at people necessarily, manipulating the situations for their narrow corporate interests, the same way the narrow autocrats and their clients in the private sector kept the pie small. Take the case of Algeria. During the oil boom, Bouteflika to make to keep friendship with the army increased their spending to something like 15% of total expenditure. As oil prices came down, this is now 30% of oil revenues. It's an enormous stake on the resources, the smaller amount of resources coming to the country. You would think that if a more democratic system arises, it will be the ruin of the lifestyle of the army. So they're also very much driven by a corporatist drive. And it's important to understand the economics and the political economy in order to find more cooperative solutions to reduce their opposition to change in the future. So just to conclude on this idea, it seems to me the role of the researchers is as has happened, say, in Eastern Europe during the last 10 years of the Cold War, is to work with the rest of civil society at reconstructing the basis for the economy and the polity of tomorrow. because it has been a failure and the future will have to be different from the past.
Thank you, Ishaq. We have a last question, and I think we will conclude with it about the economic fallout after the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact, I mean, how the structures that may follow the pandemic and the reforms that the country, and I believe Adel Rabah is talking about Algeria here, what these reforms and how they can challenge the privileges of the military. Do you think that this is an opportunity for social forces struggling for change, maybe to intervene?
This addressed to me?
Well, it's
okay.
not addressed to anyone in particular, but I think you may say a word about the economic impact of the post-COVID-19 and the challenges it will bring, especially for the military.
You know, Amal, I'm going to say a few words, but really send it back to you, because I think the Algerian team is doing very interesting research on the impact of COVID on the medical system, and through this on the amount of trust or lack of trust, or what COVID has revealed in terms of the very, very low capacity of a regime that has spent billions of dollars on health and is unable to deliver very basic services today. And I think this is the key point of COVID. It has revealed in many cases what was hidden, the low capacity to deliver. In countries where there was a little bit of trust in the state, the inability to deliver, the hiding of the facts, the inability to vaccinate and to reopen the economy, even in Tunisia, is revealing what was hidden. And in countries that have managed to deliver better than expected, maybe Jordan, for example, trust has actually increased in the system, and this improved trust would facilitate the kind of reforms that are needed to improve the economy in the future.
Thank you, Ishaq. Thank you all. I would very much like to thank all the participants, the panelists, for this great and inspiring discussion. As I say, this is the inaugural event of a series of events. So our next session will take place on July 5th, and it will be on gender, and we will invite the gender expert of each country team, namely Lebanon, Algeria, Iraq, Sudan, to talk about what we can learn from the gender perspective in terms of social change as well. You're all invited to attend. Thanks a lot, and I hope to see you in the next session. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye
and
bye,
thank you to the translators, of course.
Yes.
For their work.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Shirin. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.